Bruce Balmer from Total Fluency and Accelerated Language Learning Company. Today is video 6 of the 7 things you should do before you begin a language program in order to maximize your chances of success. Today we're talking about the resources to put in place before you begin. You don't need very much to learn a language, and I prefer to give practical advice rather than theoretical advice. So let me talk to you about how I approached learning French between the age of 32 and 34. It's the first language that I successfully learned as an adult. So the first thing to get is a dictionary. Now these used to cost a lot of money for a good dictionary, but today translate.google.com is entirely sufficient and actually a better dictionary for several reasons than the ones we used to have. Fortunately, it's free. The second item was a grammar book. Now I bought a university reference grammar text from Collins, which was exceedingly thorough. You could buy any of the normal books, learn Spanish, learn Italian, whatever, in 3 months, in 6 months for dummies, whatever the series is that you particularly like. And I think most of those would have all the grammar that you need. I did go a little over the top. With these 2 resources, you'll be able to use the right words in the right order, conjugated the right way. Basically, you're speaking the language, but you're still going to sound like an English person speaking a different language. So the next resource you want is a book of phrases and idioms. And so this will give you the way that the French people would say something. I bought such a book with 5,000 entries in it, but I'm sure that you can go on Google and just look up, 1,000 common phrases in whatever language you're thinking of. And so again, those resources are now free. But I wouldn't try and get the grammar for free from the internet. I'd get a book because I want something that's organized and something that's complete. I purchased one storybook, Shogun, in French, of course. I waited till I knew 4,000 words and then I started reading the book. At that point, I could read the book and really enjoy the story, get the gist of everything. I'd know somebody had been killed. I'd know that he'd been stabbed. I didn't know if it was with a knife, a dagger, a sword or something. One single storybook will give you a lot of the French phrasing, a lot of practice with the learning that you've done, a confirmation of your growing ability. And I was one of those students who struggled to start my French homework at school, but I found it difficult to put this book down, literally. And I always used to marvel at the transformation of my experience. So pick a good book by an author that you like. In my experience, you're better off picking an author you're familiar with that's been translated into your target language rather than going to an author from that language because you may or may not like their stories. Okay, the next resource is not strictly necessary, but very, very early on in this program, I bumped into a girl on the train called Gwenaëlle, and unsurprisingly, given her name, she was French. I recruited her into my French program as somebody to whom I could send written work and she would slash it up, mark it in red, what was wrong with it, so it would allow me to focus on where my weaknesses were. But mostly it was a confirmation of my growing ability and it just made it real and fun. A set of blank flashcards. I ended up with 36,000 of these. They're about the size of a credit card. That's the best size to get. Flashcards are and have always been one of the most effective ways to accumulate knowledge. Before I began my French program, I had a fairly profound understanding of accelerated learning. That was probably the single most important resource that I had at my disposal. But if there's an equal first, it was this: time. This program was going to take me 2 years to learn French, and I put aside an hour and a quarter a day every day and made that an inviolate piece of time just for this program. From lots and lots of conversations I've had with people who started a language program and then stopped, I'd say that time was a huge factor in all of it. It's difficult for adults to find time and to keep time aside. The demands on our lives are changing. But I wouldn't start a language program until I had found a way to allocate that time. I did mine first thing in the morning before anybody else was awake so that nobody could get in the way of what I was doing. If you've tried to learn a language in the past and stopped, and maybe not just once, but 2 or 3 times for the same language, I sympathize. I don't want to go there. I've been there in the past when I was younger. It's not a great experience. You've got to find the time first before you try to begin and think of a way that you can keep that time free, except in the most extreme of circumstances. So those were the resources I used, and I added to those motivation, confidence, and technique. Let's take a moment to notice what's not in that list. I didn't use any classes, I didn't sign up for somebody else's curriculum, I didn't sign up for a program, I built my own approach. And I think it's one of the reasons why I stuck with it, because it was my approach that worked for me emotionally. I didn't need a teacher. I don't believe people do need a teacher to learn a language. I think if 300 years ago you were shipwrecked off the coast of France and you ended up living in France for the rest of your life, you would learn French. Now, I say you don't need a teacher, I mean somebody's going to come up to you and start explaining words to you and point at things and tell you what the word is for that. But we don't need a language teacher. We don't need a language class. That's what I'm saying. Learning language is the most natural thing in the world. I didn't even have a language coach. Now, one of the problems I have is that as an accelerated language learner, there are very few of those around, and so it would be very, very hard to find an accelerated language learning coach. And once you're into accelerated language learning, you can't go back to the normal approach. But if I could go back and find one, I would. And I ended up confused about things and sometimes learning something incorrectly, and it's really difficult to undo it once you've learned something incorrectly. A language coach, again, doesn't have to be a professional. It could be any native speaker. It could be a non-native speaker who's learned the language. I tend to think they work best in pairs. Actually, I'm involved in helping somebody learn some Thai at the moment who lives here in Thailand, and I pair up with a native speaker. I can usually explain things better because I've had to learn it from English, and so I've had to understand it better than a native speaker. But I still make mistakes, of course, and often she can say, here's the Thai way of saying it. What else didn't I have? I didn't use YouTube because we didn't have YouTube back then. YouTube's a great resource, I love it. It's not necessary, was my point. I didn't use podcasts because we didn't have podcasts back then. I didn't watch any movies until I was about degree level in the language. And what I also didn't have was any external imposed deadlines or discipline from an exam or certification program or somebody chasing me to hand in my homework. The single greatest challenge for me of learning French was not learning French, it's natural. As I say, if I say la maison to you a few times, it's house, la maison, house, la maison. If I do that a few times, you're going to start knowing that la maison is house. The really tough bit was keeping making the same progress, keeping putting in that same time commitment every day to get to my goal, and never letting myself off the hook. For 2 years, I never took one day off, including my birthday, including Christmas, obviously. Woefully lacking in the resources that many people would say were necessary to learn the language. How did I do? A fluency unit might be a word or an example of a grammar rule, a phrase or an idiom. 100 a day for the first 60 days, so that's all the way to B2 in the first 60 days. Free of the burden of a classroom, I managed that easily. I slowed down after that to 50 fluency units a day for the rest of my program. I wasn't sure what I needed to know and what I didn't need to know, so I figured that if I knew the word in English, I would learn it in French. And I started at the beginning of a dictionary with aardvark, and yes, I know the word aardvark, so I learnt it in French, and I carried on to the other end of the dictionary. Not very bright, not the best way to do the job, but it was what I decided to do. I ended up with 29,000 words of French. That's how I know what my vocabulary is in English. I learned 5,000 phrases and idioms. I learned 600 grammar rules and conjugations using 2,000 examples. I got to simultaneous translator level. That's a long way beyond the degree level. I gave a 1-hour presentation in Quebec without any notes in French to a group of business people and received a standing ovation for not just the talk, but the quality of my French. Actually, this is what they said to me afterwards, the Frenchness of my French. In a degree, you add about 5,000 words of vocabulary and very little grammar at that stage. You've done most of the grammar already. So this was the equivalent of something like 7 degrees worth of language learning. I completed that in a 2-year period, and I completed that in 1.25 years a day. When I talk to people about accelerated learning, sometimes they're not excited about it, especially if they're a student. They think, don't enjoy learning that much, why would I want to do more of it faster? If I say to them, how would you like to only have to study for 1.25 hours a day? to complete 7 degrees in 2 years. So maybe just 15 minutes a day if you want to just do the 1 degree and still end up months early so you can relax towards the end of the exam. Then they get excited. That's the power of accelerated learning. That and making things like this possible. I ended up completing 912 classroom hours, and my 29,000 words comes out at 32 words per hour with all the grammar, the phrasing, the practice, the reading, everything else to support those 29,000 words. I'm telling you all this to say, A, you're in good hands. We really do know what we're doing. We've done it. We've taken it to absolute extremes, so we can certainly help you with a program. If you start a language program, I'd like you to succeed. I'd like to be speaking with you in that language in a few years' time, should we be so lucky as to bump into each other in the street. In order to succeed, you want to get the right resources in place before you begin. Most people just sort of dive in. Oh, I've got a book, let's go. Or, I've signed up for a language course, let's go. And the older I get, the more times I've made things go wrong in my life, the more I realize that prior preparation and planning really does prevent piss poor performance, as the military say. And I'd like to liberate people from this idea that you need teachers. Teachers can be a wonderful assistants, though I prefer to think of them as coaches. They can be wonderful, they are not necessary. You do not need to sign up for an expensive course if you are able to create the discipline and structure in your life to carry on. Learning a language is essentially a highly repetitive task, and the master skill is to maintain an emotional state. That means that it's as easy to start tomorrow as it is today. Remember that nobody's going to give you trouble for subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you tomorrow when we'll finish off this series with a little bit on time and habit. See you tomorrow.